And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work I've done recently involving people with Down syndrome and computer interface design. And let me just start by asking, how many people know someone with Down syndrome? Okay, great. So about 4 or 5 of you. How many of you have ever thought about computer usage by people with Down syndrome? Wonderful. One person. Yes. What have you thought about it? What has your experience been?
My experience has been playing with a child I know with an iPad and having him have a lot of fun.
Okay, so having someone play with an iPad. Great. So let me tell you why I care about this topic and why I think it's interesting. So over the last few decades, the model of development and education for people with Down syndrome has really changed. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, people with Down syndrome were put in institutions. Now they grow up in the community, right? They go to school, they're in mainstream classes, they get lots of therapies like occupational therapy, speech-language therapy, they're in inclusive education. But when they transition into adulthood, often the career options are limited. And so there's this term often for people with Down syndrome, they say they usually put them into jobs of food, flowers, or filth, meaning fast food, trash collection, or gardening. And this whole story actually started, I have a background in much more traditional HCI types of questions. This whole story started years ago. This is Christmas in 2006. That's my friend Alex right over there. It's a family friend. And I saw Alex playing around. Alex has Down syndrome, and I saw him playing around on the laptop. And he was like, well, I can show you this PowerPoint slide. I've done some PowerPoint. And he was showing me all these things he could do on the laptop. It's like, okay, this is really interesting, right? How can he use these skills for employment? I thought, I'll go search, like you probably do, I'll go search the ACM Digital Library. I'll see what's out there on the topic. And I found there was nothing out there on the topic. And apparently there was no research on interaction design for people with Down syndrome. I thought, okay, well, we need to start some then. So that's actually where this started. There's a picture of Alex as a kid on a laptop. So it comes from, all these research projects really come from this core idea of that computer skills are potentially useful for employment for people with Down syndrome, but we need to first understand how people with Down syndrome interact with technology. I mean, we have 30 years of experience about blindness, and if someone's deaf, and if someone has limited use of hands, how they interact with technology. We don't know anything about how people with Down syndrome interact with technology. So you had a clarification question, or?
Well, just broad knowledge, I guess. I know
Yeah.
what Down syndrome looks like, but is there a definitive definition yet for what exactly it is?
Aha!
There you go.
There you go.
Right.
Right to the next slide. What is Down syndrome? So Down syndrome is actually a genetic condition, and it relates to the 21st chromosome. It's about 1 in 1,000 live births in the United States. Almost 500,000 people in the US have Down syndrome. And from the genetic side is sort of interesting, except from our point of view, of course, we're interested as computer scientists in how does this impact on input, output, how does this impact on interacting with a computer? And so now Down syndrome is usually categorized as a cognitive impairment. And if you think of how we typically set up all these different types of HCI issues, well, you've got your motor impairments, you've got your perceptual impairments, and you've got your cognitive impairments. But it's actually a little bit more complex than that. Because Down syndrome, even though we typically call it a cognitive impairment, it actually impacts on not only cognition, but also some fine motor skills, vision, hearing, but to varying extents. So it's a really fascinating design problem because you've got all these people with different levels of impact, right? And on different types of things that it's impacting. So in some cases it'll impact hearing, in other cases fine motor skill. So it's fascinating to me from a design point of view. Right? For instance, some of the things we know is that people with Down syndrome have documented visual processing strengths. So this is from now the medical literature, that they're very strong with visual processing, but they have many more challenges with auditory issues, right? With hearing things. And so, okay, well, how does that then translate into interface design? So we're really interested in this topic because if we figure out how people with Down syndrome really interact with computers, then potentially we could learn much more about how to use it for career development. What type of computer skills they need to learn while growing up in school. How do you improve the activities of daily living? One of the core challenges for any type of disability population is very often unemployment rates are pretty high. And in the population of people with Down syndrome, it's been reported 80% and above of adults with Down syndrome are unemployed. So clearly, you sometimes find these things where like, ooh, the more you read, the more interesting this is, the more this could have impact, the more we need to learn about this. We need to do some research studies. So right now there are actually 5 out there, about 5 published about people with Down syndrome and technology. One of them was in my universal usability book, and that was one that a different group did, a case study of participatory design of a website for people with Down syndrome. I'm not going to cover that one in my presentation today because I already have limited time. But I'm going to talk about the other 4 studies that we did, that my team did. The survey of over 500 children and young adults with Down syndrome, the ethnographic observations of 10 expert adult users with Down syndrome, the usability testing of iPad usage involving 10 adults with Down syndrome, and an experimental design of different authentication mechanisms. Now, you might say, well, this is kind of interesting. So you're doing these different age groups, different levels of expertise. You're using 4 different methods. Right, because there's nothing out there. So we started with sort of what's the broadest thing we could do. Let's do a few studies. Let's try different methods, see what we learn from the different methods. And then we finally got to one where we say, OK, we have enough knowledge now where we can actually do an experimental design to try and figure out a question related to interface design. So I'm going to talk about those 4, the survey, the observations, usability testing, and the experimental design. So let's start with the survey that we did. And so the survey just started out with, we started in 2007 with that. And the survey just related to getting an overview, a very broad, and that's what surveys are good at, right? Getting very shallow data from a very large number of people. And so we just started trying to get as many responses as possible to learn more about children with Down syndrome, young adults. How do they use technology? What problems do they face? How early do they start? So it's a 56-question online survey. We partnered with a number of parent groups in doing all of these studies, so like the National Down Syndrome Congress, as well as local groups in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. So our goal was to understand, again, young children and young adults, but not adults. Now, we found that most of the children had already started using technology and computers by like age 5, age 6, over 80% by age 6. But there was this fascinating gap between the skills they needed to learn and sort of the design approach. So basically, imagine an application that's designed for a 9-year-old, right? And it has the aesthetics of a 9-year-old, and it's basically designed to teach the skills that a 9-year-old would need to learn. Well, we found that in situations like that, people with Down syndrome, maybe they need to learn the skills of a 7-year-old, but they're 9, but they want the design of a 9-year-old. So basically the design and lots of cutesy cartoon characters didn't work for them. They said, this is for a baby, this is not for me, even if some of the other skills are things that they really needed to learn. And we also found that passwords were very problematic. That was one of the biggest problems that we found, is that children, even into their teens, were still having a lot of problems with passwords. Input-output, mouse, keyboard were most common. There's this stereotype that when you talk about people with disabilities, if you have a disability, you use assistive technology, right? You use a different input device or a different output device. And that's the way we tend to think of these things. But yet, we found very little usage of anything other than keyboard and mouse by our young children and young adults with Down syndrome. They're not using assistive technologies. And so that's different than the model. We often look at disability at a very broad range. Well, people with disabilities do X. Oh, well, let's be more specific. People with motor impairment do X. Oh, then you need to keep breaking it down because you can never really say everyone with a disability does X. Everyone interacts in this way. Everyone needs this. There are really a lot of shades of gray there. In terms of keyboard use, we found that keyboard usage was actually problematic. That for a lot of the kids, rather than using both hands, multiple fingers, they were doing hunt and peck, or maybe 2-finger hunt and peck, kind of like this, right? And obviously that's problematic because you're never going to get to the level of being really effective using a keyboard if you're typing like this. So that was really interesting. And we had looked at kids, we had done a survey, and so the next step was that we decided we want to look at some expert users. We kept hearing people tell us about, oh, you should see my friend Steve, or you should see my friend Amanda, has Down syndrome, right, fantastic. So we said, okay, let's examine kind of the other end of the spectrum. Let's look at expert users. So we did a study where we observed 10 adult expert users. How do we define an expert user with Down syndrome? At least 5 years of computer usage, at least 5 days each week, at least 10 hours each week, right? They use all sorts of office automation software. They can surf the web. So now this was an older group. Unlike the survey, we were there physically to observe them. It was 22 to 38-year-olds, right? Again, expertise, lots of experience. One of the things we learned, so we're trying to figure out, well, how does someone become an expert user? How does someone with Down syndrome become an expert? And we found that most of our, in fact, all of our users had taken computer classes. Every single one of them had taken formal computer training classes, some as early as elementary school, right? To learn everything from keyboarding to office automation, internet searching, PowerPoint, web design. Some of them did it in community college as well. We observed our users typically switched back and forth, as most users do. You know, I'm on a laptop here. Oh, wait a minute, I'm going to go use something on my smartphone. Oh, wait, oh, you know, I got something else here. Wait a minute, here's my cell phone. I got to do. And so you find that they were very effective in switching, in task switching. And here is something else interesting. Unlike all of the users in the survey, our expert users, every single one of them, both hands, multiple fingers for typing. And while they had all taken computer training classes, most of them had actually taken keyboarding classes as well. So there was certainly a lot of variability in the speed and accuracy of typing, but they all were, you know, really touch typists as if they had taken a class. They had multiple email accounts. And this, I still think, is one of the most fascinating things about email usage. Now, when we observed most of our users, they had maybe 10 to 20 emails in their inbox. That was it. A number of them had no messages in their inbox. I'm thinking, okay, is no one emailing you? And that wasn't it. They actually cleaned out their inbox obsessively. And we had multiple people who, the moment an email came in, they responded to it, they deleted the message, then they went to the sent messages folder and they deleted that message, right? It was to the level that one of our users who we observed at a workplace actually had a sign saying, read email but do not delete it, next to their desk, right? So they take it very, very seriously that they want to keep their email inboxes clean, they want to respond to things, they want to make sure they don't have any out there. And you might say, well, this seems a little bit different. But when you then go to the medical literature and you find out that people with Down syndrome have a much higher incidence of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, you say, okay, this makes sense. This is happening with a lot of people. So, you know, there are all these interesting quirks and differences. It's just fascinating. Here is one of the most fascinating things also. You're all familiar with what a visual CAPTCHA is. You know, you've seen those. We have it in the upper right-hand corner there. So we actually do a lot of research in my team about audio CAPTCHAs for blind people. And so the visual CAPTCHAs, we wondered maybe visual CAPTCHAs would be good. Maybe how would it work? So most of the people with Down syndrome said, oh, I love those. Those are easy, right? You don't often hear people saying, oh, good, I love these, when they experience one of those, you know, CAPTCHAs. And so we had a really high, it was above 95% task success rate on the visual CAPTCHAs. And so it's like, wow, this is interesting. We actually, in other studies we did afterwards, saw the same thing, where people with Down syndrome would say, oh, good, I love these. And I don't know many people who say, I love these when they get a visual CAPTCHA. I mean, do you? Do you all love them? No? Yeah?
What's the non-Down syndrome task?
It's actually lower than people with Down syndrome. So people with Down syndrome actually have a higher success rate on visual CAPTCHAs than a typical population without Down syndrome, without any disabilities. So, you know, that's kind of fascinating. But that also ties in with the visual strengths of people with Down syndrome. They typically, and while every individual is different, as a whole, they're much stronger visually than they are auditorily. So again, we talked about some of our common themes. None of these expert users used any type of assistive technology. Again, the stereotype is you have a disability, you use assistive technology, right? Most people are familiar with that's what you learn, and not one of our users with Down syndrome, our expert users, used any type of modification, not even making the screen larger, nothing. All 10 of them, right, could type well. Again, multiple fingers, both hands. All 10 of them previously had taken formal classes on computing. They had a high success rate on visual CAPTCHAs. And this is very interesting. They were very observant of visual cues in the screen layout. So everything from battery strength to Wi-Fi strength to, there were things that when we were observing, we didn't notice, that they said, oh, look, I better plug it in, my battery's going low. Or, oh, you know, look, the internet looks like the internet's down. Right? And so they picked up a lot of these visual cues. Again, tying in with the visual strengths. Very interesting, just really, really interesting. So once we had finished that study, we wanted to examine touchscreen usage, and specifically iPad usage. And by the way, these are all, if you go to my webpage, these are all available as downloads, or if you prefer ACM Digital Library, those last two papers were both assets papers. This one's in the Journal of Usability Studies. So we're very interested in studying iPad usage by people with Down syndrome. Why? Well, there appears to be a disconnect between the medical literature, which says that people with Down syndrome have trouble with fine motor skills, outright. And what we see in our computer usage, which is people with Down syndrome have no trouble with their fine motor skills in terms of like mouse usage and touch screens, is really fascinating. The original survey, of course, was done before touch tablets were very popular. People are using them more in workplace settings, they're using them more in social settings. So it's really important to understand, how do people use multi-touch screens if they have Down syndrome? Now, we had sort of hypothesized that probably touchscreen usage should be easier, because rather than a mouse where you're moving your hand over here and you see the pointer move over here where it's indirect, and you also have to have multiple fingers for grasping it. If you have like an iPad, guess what? You can use only one finger. It's direct. You see the pointing, it moves on the screen. So it's much more direct in terms of pointing. For simple gestures, you only need one finger. So we wanted to see how people did. And actually, they did very well with it. We were also very interested in how they use on-screen keyboards, right? Because that would be kind of interesting. Now, this was just usability testing. So this was not experimental design. The password study was a highly controlled study. This one was not. We wanted people to use their actual email accounts, their actual Facebook accounts, and we just wanted to get a better understanding by observing. But unlike the ethnographic observation of the expert users, where we just kind of said, well, show us how you use it, here we asked them to perform specific tasks, as would be done in usability testing. And again, there's some things we couldn't control, so we said usability testing. It's very natural, right? We want to understand not only the interface, but the users themselves. And we wouldn't want to do an experimental design because we couldn't generalize from the iPad to the Galaxy or something else anyway. Generalization would be really hard. We just wanted to understand it better. And so we asked them to complete a series of tasks using Facebook, email applications, calendaring, price comparison, some note-taking for touch typing. We did some pilot studies. We had 10 adults with Down syndrome, all above the age of 18. And again, all of them have Facebook accounts, email, and basic familiarity with touch screens. So what are the things we found with our iPad study? Well, first of all, we still had a lot of problems as it related to passwords. People still had a lot of trouble remembering their passwords, and so what we found is most of the time people had saved their passwords in memory, right? If not, they couldn't remember them. They often had to call home or, what's the password again? Because they're just used to automatically logging in with saved passwords. Visual captchas, though, tended to be easy. That continued. Again, in our iPad study, we got the same thing. Oh, I love these. That happened more than once. Features that people with Down syndrome really found very useful were things that are typical universal usability approaches. Things like search boxes, things like auto-suggest, things that are part of our everyday interfaces. In terms of typing speed, that varied a lot, right? Because what we found is that unlike with our expert user study on physical keyboards where, all of our 10 expert users all use both hands, multiple fingers. In terms of the touchscreen usage, some were using on the touchscreen keyboard, one finger hunt and peck. Some were doing the two finger. Some were using a combination. Some started doing this and then started doing like with the middle finger or then started using a thumb. So it really jumped around, and there was definitely a very wide range of typing speeds. Everything from 3.3 words a minute to 16.3 words a minute with an average of 9.3. And by the way, 16.3 for a touchscreen keyboard is not that bad. Yeah?
I was going to ask what the mean is for the general population.
I'm sorry. I haven't actually found one that says the mean for the general population. I found a few touchscreen keyboard studies that they say novices. They say people who are new to it. You know what I mean? So it's not an exact match. I'll say that the 16.3 is not that far away from the average for people who are new to touchscreen keyboards. But I don't have a sort of a general population average. It's clearly not near expert users, but it's relatively near novice users of touchscreen keyboards. And obviously, over time, the more we use touchscreen keyboards, what the average is might also change. There were two areas that were actually very problematic with the iPad usage. One was that there were a lot of non-standard icons. Remember I said that when we did the ethnographic observations, they were always pointing things out in the environment, graphical things in the environment. And so it was very interesting because there were icons that they said, I don't know what that means. And I give you some example here from Gmail. We've got that one with the bulleted list, that one which is for a new message. They got the search with the magnifying glass, but the others they didn't understand. And then on the iPad, the calendar was very problematic. So if you've used those before, you know where you've got sort of, it's a scroll here and a scroll here, and it's a very narrow band there. And so you have to have extreme fine motor control. This is the thing that they had a lot of trouble with.
Is the trouble with iconography distinct on the touchpad? It seems like that would be an issue on any new interface.
Is it distinct to the touchpad? No, it's just that they were using, in many cases, when you tried to pull up your email account, they would serve up the iPad version, and the iPad version had new icons that were not in, let's say, the desktop version. So it's not that it was specific to the iPad, except that the iPad version had all these new icons. People were saying, I don't know what that was. But to give you an example of the type of thing that was problematic, Facebook, when they were trying to log out of Facebook, iPad version as well as a desktop version, you know, it's the upper right-hand corner. You basically have to get a pull-down menu to select log out. They had a lot of trouble with that. Why? Well, we know that they have trouble with pull-down menus, right? And it also related then to some of the fine motor control where they had to point at that very specific point. They found it much easier to just hit X to close the window. You know, which it's very possible the general population does as well. In terms of methodology, in doing studies like this, it was very interesting because we've also learned a lot about sort of how you do studies involving people with Down syndrome. I'll give you some examples. So every person that we worked with had a different personality, different behavior, different approach. Some people were incredibly talkative. Some people had trouble focusing. Other people were highly focused and barely spoke. You know, and that was just a personality difference that you have to account for. I'll give an example of one thing, one adjustment we had to make. There was one of the tasks we had, and that relates to the start and end date for an event there. One of the tasks that we had related to asking them to put down a party. Right? And the party like began at noon and started at 2. And we had one user who said, I will not do that. We're like, why? That's too short a party. You need the party to be longer. We're like, okay, but it's not a real party. We're just doing it in the task. And he said, I'm not doing it. I want a longer party. So we're like, okay, how about you make it 12 to 4? He's like, okay, that's fine. Right? And again, from our point of view, we really didn't care if it was 12 to 2 or 12 to 4. We were trying to keep things standard. But you know, we didn't care. It didn't make a difference. We were trying to understand the interaction. So if that was, people with Down syndrome can be very literal. So if that was something that made things go more smoothly, you know, don't say, for instance, that you want to just put down a birthday party on May 25th. Right? What are they going to say if you say that as a task? Right? That's not my birthday. Whose birthday is that? So, you know, you have to learn to sort of adapt. We use, for instance, rather than asking a Likert scale, right, we presented a visual Likert scale. Okay, so this is very difficult. I imagine that you could do it with, you know, smiley faces and frowns, but we didn't need to do that. Everyone understood the concept. But having the visual aspect to it that they could point to definitely helped. You know, overall, a lot of the findings from the medical literature, the medical clinical literature related to people with Down syndrome really don't apply to computer usage. Because it says, well, people with Down syndrome have trouble with fine motor skills, and people have trouble with this. I'll bet part of that has to do with the fact that they were not very motivated for whatever test they were being tested on. You know, if they're motivated, we saw a lot of people who are very effective on iPads. We saw a lot of people, oh, I want to try this. No, I want to keep at it. Right? We had one person who said, well, I'm going to keep at this. And I'm going to keep at this. I am not a quitter. I'm going to keep at this. And they kept at it for something like 10 minutes. Right? And so, you know, you have to be understanding and aware and flexible to understand kind of what the issues are and how to do it in a way where you understand what you are trying to understand while making sure that they're not saying, I refuse to do this. Now, with some more of this experience and with some more of this data, we said, okay, we think now we're ready to really look at an experimental design. involving people with Down syndrome. And this is going to be showing up in ACM transactions on accessible computing. Now, we know that people with Down syndrome already are very good at solving visual CAPTCHAs. Originally, by the way, we were going to do a study comparing visual to audio CAPTCHAs, but they were so effective with the visual CAPTCHAs, we said, let's look at passwords, which we know are problematic. We're going to learn a lot more by doing password usage. So we know that people with Down syndrome are great with visual CAPTCHAs, but have trouble with password usage. So our goal was to compare 3 different types of authentication mechanisms for people with Down syndrome. Your standard alphanumeric password, mnemonic passwords, and do people know what mnemonic passwords are? When you take a phrase and then you take the first letter of each one, so like I ate my oatmeal today, it can be I ate my O today. Right? Typically, they say in the research literature, mnemonic passwords may be stronger than regular passwords. We'll see if that's true. And then also graphical passwords. Right? And there are 2 types of graphical passwords that we could examine. Recognition-based graphical passwords where, for instance, in this case, let's say at 100 images originally they selected in their password, and then they had to pick 3 in a certain order. So like these are album covers here, right? And then every time they log in, they're presented with 30 choices, and they have to do 3. That's recognition. Whereas the other one is a recall-based password, and you see this now on some of the new Microsoft tablets, where you have to take a picture and you have to point, and you basically have recall of where in the object you targeted. So you can do sort of a pointing, which brings up other issues related to pointing, but at least it's the 2 different types of graphical passwords that potentially you could do. Where you have to recognize it versus where you have to recall what you drew on the grid. And of course, most people in here, I assume, have taken at least an intro to HCI class, right? So, no, okay, 2 or 3 have not. Are most of you generally familiar with the recognition versus recall aspects of HCI at least? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads, okay. So what we did here is we did an experimental design. It was a 6-week-long study. Right? Within 2 weeks, basically, they focused on one type of password within group design. We had 10 participants with Down syndrome and 20 neurotypical participants, all adults, all people above the age of 18. And what did we find? Well, a few interesting things. First of all, people with Down syndrome did, on average, take longer to create their passwords and longer to log in than the people who are neurotypical. But there was no significant difference in password strength between people with Down syndrome and people who are neurotypical. The passwords were just as strong. They just took a little bit longer to log in. In terms of registration time for people with Down syndrome, there was not a difference between the mnemonic passwords, graphical, and alphanumeric. So basically, it took about the same amount of time. And there was a major learning effect for people with Down syndrome. So it was very slow at the beginning, but the second time they logged in, the third time they logged in, the fourth time they logged in, really, it was getting quicker and quicker and quicker by far. In some cases, a drop of 50% from the time it originally took. And interestingly enough, I'm always fascinated by these things, where people with disabilities are better at a task than people without disabilities. And we found that neurotypical users are more likely to enter graphical passwords in the incorrect order. People with Down syndrome were more effective at entering graphical passwords than neurotypical users, right? And again, they're better at visual CAPTCHAs. You can almost see a pattern developing about their visual strengths really help them. It's really fascinating. So you might say, well, how does this lead to improved design? What might we need to consider? How does all this translate into actual interface design? Well, things like you might need to allow for a little bit more time to create and enter passwords if someone has Down syndrome. So automatic timeouts might be problematic. People with Down syndrome might be effective with graphical passwords, but it may not apply to other cognitive impairment. We're always trying to say, well, okay, how can we take what we've learned here and apply it to other populations? We know people with Down syndrome have visual strengths. So what we're saying about people with Down syndrome may be very effective with graphical passwords, that may not translate to people with autism. That may not translate to people with other types of cognitive issues. So, one thing that came up in our study also is that we had a fair number of people with Down syndrome who use their own name in the password. And so it may be useful to give like a little widget reminder of, do not use your own name. Reminder of caps lock is on, because that came up too. So, these are some little things that you can do to help make interfaces more usable for people with Down syndrome. Over time, our hope is that some of these could get into like a standard, like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Because obviously, you're not ever going to design a website just for people with Down syndrome or just for this. I mean, unless you're designing a Down syndrome topic website. So you want to find ways to get these little specifications into international standards for people with disabilities. So here are some as an example. Now, remember I said we started this with, we're kind of trying to figure out what might potential jobs be for Alex outside of the typical food, flowers, or filth. Right? Knowing that he's good on computers, knowing we've learned more, how could we translate this into something useful? Well, it's important to figure out how to get computer skills to people with Down syndrome as early as possible. Take classes in elementary school. Take classes, if they won't give it to you at the school system, go to local community college. Get tutors. Do whatever you need. Because the idea is that if you have formal classes, that seems to really help. That should be in IEP plans, individualized education plans that kids with disabilities get in the school system. When they start putting together transition plans for how to transition out of high school, computer skills should be included. If there are any post-secondary programs, so one of them that many of our users were in was the George Mason University Mason Life Program, which is sort of a transition program to teach life skills after you're finished with high school. So there are a lot of ways to kind of figure out how do we get more computer skills training in there. How do we get it in there? And very often you may need to argue with state officials. There's one state official in the state of Maryland who told us outright, we would not give computer skills to people with Down syndrome. They can't use computers. And I'm like, okay, I can give you a lot of evidence to show you're wrong if you want, because you are, but why would you just make such a broad generalization? But yet we often do that. Well, people with X can't do Y, and I know because of Z, even though probably that's not true. So, we need to kind of get this information out there into the policy-making environment. We need to figure out how to get it into the decision-making environment in schools. One thing that was very interesting, if you're interested in this topic, we actually did a panel at the National Down Syndrome Congress involving 4 adults with Down syndrome who actually have jobs where they use IT skills for office work. So things like database managers and customer relationship management. So if you're interested, I'm not going to play the whole video, but I just want to let you know, go to YouTube and you can search on Down syndrome information technology, right? And there's a great video there where we've interviewed these 4 adults. I'll show you so you can see what it looks like. Here we are, we're at a panel where the whole video is captioned, and so you can hear their stories, you can hear what they do, you can hear how they got their jobs, you can hear how they gain their skills. There's also a link on my homepage to that. And some of the jobs we found are appropriate for people with Down syndrome. And when I say appropriate, I mean they're already adults with Down syndrome doing these jobs. Things like data entry. Things like data migration. How many times do you have to move data from one hard drive to another device to another, one phone to another? We're always moving data from one thing. We're changing it from our CDs to put it onto our iPods, put it onto our... Right? Data migration is actually something that would be great for people with Down syndrome. It involves accuracy and a repetitive nature, and they are great at both of those things. Things like inventory management, being a content manager on a website, or document management. One of the people in the panel there, in the video actually talks, he works as a document manager for the federal government. And what he does is he actually works with hundreds and thousands of documents from lawyers in the government. And he keeps track of, they're always checking him in, checking him out, scanning them, storing them, moving around. There's versioning. Right? And it's a perfect fit for his skills. So really there's some great potential job ideas out there for how to make sure that people with Down syndrome can get employment in working in IT. You might say, this is great. What are some next ideas? Let me, by the way, suggest, if any of you are very interested in this topic, you've got a great resource here in the greater Boston area. The Down Syndrome Clinic at Mass General Hospital is actually very interested in things related to transitioning and employment. And so if any of you are interested in continuing and doing this type of work, you may want to let me know. I'll connect you with the folks there. You may want to partner with them. So we need more studies, though. We need more research studies on things like eye tracking, right? How do people with Down syndrome look at the screen? Do they look at it any differently? Do they scan differently? Do the heat maps look differently? Right? Icon identification, we talked about that being a problem. Right? Maybe the general population has trouble with those icons. Maybe there are certain aspects of the icons that are problematic. We don't know. Auditory identification, obviously for, if we use things ear cons, so rather than icons, if we use sound clips to identify things. It'd be really interesting to see how they do with those, especially since, auditory hasn't been really a strength for people with Down syndrome. Keyboard typing on touch screens, I think some more structured studies on just that would be interesting. And even Fitts Law type studies of pointing, I think on a touchpad would be great. So there are tons of really interesting research questions here that haven't been investigated, that I'm hoping to find people who really want to collaborate with and go off and do great work. We need more work done in this area. There are all these great questions where we just don't know the answer. And so I hope you all feel encouraged to go work in this realm. Before I finish up, I should just give a thank you to my partners on the Down syndrome work. So on all these various studies, we've got Heidi Feng from Towson and UMBC, Libby Kumin from Loyola University, Maryland, Ant Ozak from UMBC, Brian Wentz from Frostburg State University, 3 of the doctoral students at Towson, Nana, Rumin, and Yao. Right? We've also had a lot of help from parent groups, so the National Down Syndrome Congress, as well as local groups in Maryland and Virginia. And part of this research was also funded by the National Science Foundation, so of course we thank NSF. And I hope this brings you a new topic that you hadn't previously thought about. I hope you feel encouraged to go out there and study some of these issues. And now I'm happy to take questions.